So hello and welcome. I hope you're having a marvelous day. My name's Charles Collegy and I'm your host for today's webinar, our DevOps.com webinar, and sponsored by Fairwinds. So I thank them for participating on the topic of Kubernetes, the Agony and the Ecstasy. I got to work on that word.
Ecstasy.
Yep.
That's okay. It's a weird
But
word.
we're going to talk about the pain and the different stages of maturity. They're going to go and talk about the experiences around security and monitoring at every stage of the life cycle and how we can overcome that pain. Now, our speakers today are going to be Kendall Miller, who's the president at Fairwinds, and Ivan Fetch, who is a solution architect at Fairwinds. And I know they're eager to jump into today's webinar, but before we do that, I have to do some housekeeping items. The first is that the session is being recorded, so you can come back and go on demand, go to devops.com and pull up the archives of our former and webinars, and you can take a look at this one. Tell your friends, tell others, and it will be available again on devops.com. Now, I'm also going to take just a moment to go over our big marker platform here that you're viewing on. And if you notice on the right-hand side, there's a place for a chat. So in there, you can talk to the speakers, or talk to any of us, talk to your other attendees, and let us know where you're from, and so we can start have a communications and while we're going on in these activities. There is also a Q&A section there, so if you have questions for Kendall or Ivan throughout the presentation, just put them in there, and we should have some time afterwards to go over some of those questions. Also, there is a drawing for 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. That will be done at the end of the webinar. So please stay and see if you're one of our winners. So we're going to jump into today's session. Again, we're going to talk about the pain and agony and ecstasy of Kubernetes with Kendall Miller and Ivan Fetch of Fairwinds. So I'm going to let them introduce themselves, and take it away, Kendall.
All right. Thanks, Charles, and welcome, folks. This is the agony and the ecstasy, pain at the different stages of maturity. So Ivan and I are going to be talking about the different stages of Kubernetes maturity, the different problems you're going to be running into along the way as your company looks at and then continues to choose to adopt Kubernetes. So we'll get into some more details about that in just a second. First of all, my name is Kendall Miller. I'm president at Fairwinds. We are a Kubernetes company, and I'll get into some more details about that in just a second. I've been here about 6 years talking about Kubernetes incessantly for over 5 now, which is a long time to think about, isn't it, Ivan? Kubernetes hasn't been around all that long. So I'm very excited to be here, and looking forward to diving into this. And Ivan, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, definitely. My name's Ivan Fetch. I'm a solutions architect with Fairwinds. Also done a fair amount of SRE work, helping our customers do all sorts of things Kubernetes. So thank you all for joining us and potentially watching the recording later. And let's get into it.
Yeah, and that's Ivan's way of saying he actually has messed with all of this at a very deep level all the time, and actually knows what he's talking about. So I feel like I need to throw in that you do actually know what you're saying here. So real quick, at a high level, who Fairwinds is. We are interested in helping companies do Kubernetes right. So we provide software and services and open source to help folks leverage Kubernetes. It's my belief that everyone in the world would be using Kubernetes right now. It's a hype word for a reason. The juice is worth the squeeze, as the saying goes. And but it is new, it is complicated, and so Fairwinds exists to solve those problems. We have a software solution that exposes to you how to build and configure and secure Kubernetes the right way. At the end of this, we'll probably have time and I'll walk through a brief demo of that to help you along the different stages of your maturity. We have a whole bunch of open source. If you're using Kubernetes, I can basically guarantee we have an open source project that's relevant to you. Everything from managing role-based access control to configuration validation to leveraging the vertical pod autoscaler to get your resource recommendations right, et cetera. And then finally, we also have services, and that's for the companies that come to us and say, make my infrastructure problem go away. We can do that as well. We can build and maintain your infrastructure for you all the way through. So that's who Fairwinds is. It's because we maintain all of this infrastructure at scale that we see what the problems are that people have as they adopt it. And it's because we've been managing Kubernetes for sometimes 5 years for some of our clients. We see how they mature through the adoption of it, and that's what we're here to talk to you about today. Before we get started, let's do a quick poll. Where are you on your Kubernetes journey? This helps us frame a little bit of how we go about this conversation and where we share. So if you guys can pull up for me, there we go. The options here are, I'm learning about containers in Kubernetes. I'm planning to use it in 6 to 12 months. I'm only using or testing in a development environment. I'm using it in production. Or I have no plans to use it, which if you're attending this webinar to find out that you have no plans and that is the right decision, I'm going to talk you out of that because my company's entire business model depends on the beauty of Kubernetes despite the agony and the ecstasy. Yeah, go ahead and submit that. We'll give it a little bit longer and then we will move on and I'll share the results. Talk with you about the results of that before we move on. But
well, right now, Kendall, you do have some people you're going to have to convince to move from
no plans to use. Come
on! Maybe they're just trolling you, though. It's hard to say.
You come to a Kubernetes. That's right. I think that's probably what's going on. I'm going to attend a Kubernetes webinar and tell them I'm never going to use it. That's why I'm here.
It's okay if you're just here. If you're just here for companionship, also, we're finally in that. So.
It's been a long year, and if you just need to hear the voice of another human being, we're happy to provide that as a service as well. Yep. Okay, we'll wrap up the poll in 10 seconds here. And we can go ahead and close that. Okay, now I have to go over here and click on my buttons and see what the results are. So we have 35% of you are just learning about containers in Kubernetes. 16% plan to use it in the next 6 to 12 months. 25%, 26% using only in testing and development. Only 13% of you are using it in production. Don't worry, there are phases of the maturity that are still relevant to you after you get there. And 10% with no plans to use. Okay, well, we're here to convince you that this is the right thing to do. There will be agony, but there will also be ecstasy. Right, Ivan? Okay, let's go ahead. Not creepy at all?
No, that was...
Let's go ahead and dive in. So phase 0, as you get started in this, there is a journey before the journey to Kubernetes, and that is the preparation. And this is relevant even this morning. A good friend of mine at a very large organization said that he asked all of his engineers, remind me again why we're thinking of moving to Kubernetes. What is the business reason? And he said there was silence. So there are business reasons, but you should probably know what those are before you go ahead and make a decision to move to Kubernetes.
I actually want to go backwards a little bit, if that's okay. It's going to be super awkward if you say no. But let's talk a little bit about what we're following here when we're going to talk about these phases and why do these phases exist and so on and so forth. So we created this thing that we call the maturity model, and this is what we're going to be using as our guide and talking through here today. And you all can go check this out as well and continue to refer back to it. And so I'm going to talk briefly about what it is and why it even exists. So as you journey into cloud native apps and containers, we've created this thing called the maturity model. It's a series of phases designed to help you focus on where you are right now in the moment and not get potentially a little bit too distracted. what's next for you to learn in the phase that you're in, and also to help people feel a little bit less isolated in their journey. So how does it do that? It's an extension on a common paradigm that we've seen a lot of folks talk about, which is the day 0 through day 2 paradigm of where are you in your Kubernetes. And we're not going to confuse things too much by talking about that, but I just want to say that the day 0 through 2 model tends to be pretty broad, and doesn't tend to show the level of detail that you're going to experience as you actually go through the journey. So the day 0 through 2 model often can feel somewhat oversimplified, and it's not super helpful to the folks that are working like you all in the day-to-day operations of actually going through this journey. So the maturity model is something we made that's a lot more comprehensive. It illuminates your experience, helps normalize what you'll probably be experiencing when you go through this journey, know what's next, panic a little bit less, and then provide some resources to help you and a common language for you to articulate internally with your exec team, with your coworkers, and in conversations. Why do you need more budget for this project? Why is it taking as long as it is, et cetera? So it's a great basis for us to level set on this and have conversations.
Yeah, thanks, Ivan, for making me back up. So I just loaded up here in my shared screen the Kubernetes Maturity Model, and you can go to kubernetesmaturitymodel.com. It actually forwards to Fairwinds' website, but this is where this is the high-level overview of what we're going to be talking about today, and it gets into some detail. You can click on any one of these, and it goes into those details. So if after today, we are going to share this slide deck, that's always a question that comes through. But if you want to dig deeper into it, you can just go to kubernetesmaturitymodel.com and dig into that. So thank you, Ivan, for stopping me and backing me up. So back to my question. Let's talk about some of the business use cases. What are some of the reasons besides just, I heard this is exciting technology and want to say I've worked with it, to migrate your company to Kubernetes, Ivan?
So you want to be able to answer the question, what problems are we solving? You want to agree on some organizational goals and ask the right business questions for your organization to be able to say yes to the investment that is one of humans and also of time and literal cost. So some of these factors that relate to some of the quote unquote pain that's part of this prep phase are going to be, does Kubernetes apply to me? Is it going to help my business? Are my applications and services architected well to be able to work as containers in Kubernetes? Do I have the right staffing and help? How much time and money will it take? Do we have the right stakeholders on board? All these things. So, this can be initially overwhelming to find the right information, and while you're making sure that you validate Kubernetes for your business and your apps.
Yeah, and I think, to be clear too, some of the most common reasons that we see for people to move to Kubernetes, some of the problems they're trying to solve are, they've outgrown the paths that they're on. That's actually a very common thing, right? Heroku is the right solution for most startups to some significant level of maturity, or some other paths like Heroku. And at some point, you need more granular control, or the cost of that paths has become prohibitive, and you can afford to hire an entire team to build and maintain Kubernetes for less than the overhead of the paths. So those are two of the very common reasons. I think there's a bunch of things around the way that you do development with containers, the way that Kubernetes handles internal DNS and scaling that are really nice reasons to move to Kubernetes, but you have to be at a certain level as an organization for that to really make sense. And so, so those are some of the common business reasons.
And to add a bit to that, which was, this was your core question, which I sort of preloaded and sidled up to, but didn't directly answer in the end. Containers are going to be this nice way to package up your application and its dependencies to run reliably in more places. So that's a win on containers. Now, Kubernetes as the orchestrator of those containers is going to help your containers scale. So I want to run more of them all of a sudden on a particular event or metric that increases, that is indicative of my application getting more demand by my customers. And then also Kubernetes is going to help my containers recover from failure. So I've got a container that's in some sort of deadlock or has died for some reason, or I've lost a node in my Kubernetes cluster, and I want my whole system to heal, and I want my application to be back online. And as your orchestrator, Kubernetes is gonna help you get there. So those are some high level, somewhat hand wavy reasons that have a lot of detail behind them. But those are huge wins that you want to start attaching to business drivers. If you've got previous issues with reliability of your applications and being able to serve your customers.
Yeah. And John, I see this note that came through in the public chat. We have a third party that threw this at us, and I'm stuck trying to understand it. Don't worry, that your Agony will be paired with Ecstasy, and we will get into some of the details of the why and places that you can go to understand it better as well. Also, our software will be helpful. But we need to keep moving. We are only on phase 0, and we are 15 minutes into this, so we got to get the move on. So let's talk about phase 1, transform. So you've made the decision, you've sat down and talked about it. What is the business value we're going to get out of this? How are we going to move forward? Why does this make sense as a company to choose Kubernetes? And now you need to start kicking the tires with it. It's really hard to make a transformation unless you have a way to go fiddle with it. And it's sort of like spending all of your days really hoping to someday become a violin player, but never buying a violin to see if you feel the strings or something. You can at least walk into a store and hold it up under your chin and say, this seems like the right thing or not, right? And I know that that's a ridiculous analogy, but I'm going to go with it. Ivan, talk a little bit about just standing up a proof of concept. Where do you get started? How do you do this without boiling the whole ocean?
Yeah, I think an important sort of underpinning to this phase is that it is, as you said, a POC. It also does begin what really is an IT transformation. And while this can be part of making or breaking whether Kubernetes is a good fit, it's important to acknowledge the considerable undertaking of this, even though it's a proof of concept. So it's beginning a paradigm shift, taking something that's important, which is your business, taking something that you've put a considerable amount of time and effort into, and it's your baby, essentially, and you're putting transformation efforts into that. So in terms of your question, how do we not boil the ocean? Acknowledge that you're beginning an iterative process. Where to start, of course, is going to depend a lot on the perspective of your individual engineers and your business. But to give some examples, you want to containerize an application first and run something in Kubernetes. And so you might need to make your application a bit more cloud native and determine which apps should I run in Kubernetes? What do I want to start with? As you start looking at your application architecture, you're going to be revisiting dependencies and requirements that might be a little bit less cloud native, right? You might have shared file systems, for example, that your applications need to access to communicate with one another instead of using HTTP APIs, other network requirements, communication, other infrastructure that your apps need. That as you dig into your app, you're going to start determining areas where you can re-architect as you go. You're also going to start getting to know Kubernetes terms and resources, like what a controller is in Kubernetes, what a pod is versus a container, and so on and so forth. How do you get a Kubernetes cluster?
I mean, reading about those things is different from kicking the tires and interacting with a pod and interacting with a node and seeing what those things mean. And that's part of why having something stood up as a POC is important. But sorry, keep going, Ivan. How do you get started with a cluster?
How do you get started with a cluster? Every cloud provider out there has a managed Kubernetes offering that makes it relatively straightforward for you to go and click in a UI and spin up a cluster. That's okay at a particular phase of this journey. We don't recommend managing your clusters that way. And we have managed Kubernetes services that not only get you a cluster, but get you a cluster with a lot of nice finishing touches and stability and security, et cetera, et cetera. But you can definitely go and get a starter Kubernetes cluster, and remember that you're iterating. Remember that this is not the cluster that you're going to necessarily go production in, although you can. And be patient. Be patient about the shift that's happening in your teams. as everyone is getting used to this pretty considerable paradigm shift in how applications run, how applications get deployed, and how things run in Kubernetes.
It's really a lot like, I like to say that the shift to Kubernetes is a lot like moving from Windows to Linux. If you've never used Linux before, it's very intimidating. And what you don't want to do is, wipe your computer, install a Linux operating system, and have that be the only thing you work with. Probably you can partition your hard drive or get a second computer or something, install a little Linux instance, and go kick the tires and get familiar with it before you decide to move all your everything over to it. So that's what we're pushing for here. If that's Raspberry Pis in your basement, great. If that's a small GKE cluster or something on DigitalOcean so you can control the cost, go kick the tires with pre-production. That'll help you get started.
Kicking the tires, not answering all the questions, right? There's don't be concerned with how am I going to manage this at scale just yet. You want to start feeling how Kubernetes will benefit your business.
So let's move on to phase 2 here then, Ivan. Deploy. So we've created a baseline. I've kicked the tires a little bit. I've learned some things the hard way. I now understand what a pod is, what a node is. I've fiddled with a control plane, maybe broken one or two. See what happens. And it's time to really get started. This is the real climb. How do we move on to phase 2 and deploy? What does this look like?
Yeah, so you've got an application or maybe more containerized in Kubernetes. You're starting to feel what that feels like. You maybe even have an application in production. That's certainly something we see as part of a POC. So this phase is starting to explore the functionality between quote unquote our clusters work and what is it like to be more production ready. So you want to not be afraid of the continued beginner status in this phase. Things will feel still a little bit slower than you like. Teams might struggle to use Kubernetes in the way that they ultimately want, even though you're still moving forward. So it's important to acknowledge that. This can feel like you're really bogging down in this phase, but you'll start seeing some of the self-healing benefits of Kubernetes. You'll start experimenting perhaps with certain resources like horizontal pod autoscaling to scale up your application, and you'll start seeing what happens when you run out of cluster nodes and your Kubernetes cluster needs to scale. And you'll start to get to experience some of the quote unquote magic of Kubernetes in the world of your business. You'll also start doing a little bit of CI/CD here. This is not where CI/CD gets perfected, but you're definitely going to start smoothing it out a little bit. So that's where you're using continuous integration, continuous delivery to build the app that you've containerized and maybe run it through some tests and then in the end, deploy it into a Kubernetes cluster and start to understand what that process looks like for our developer team.
Yeah, this is when you're getting started, you're reading books about climbing a mountain. That's phase 0. That phase 1 is you've gone and climbed a couple hills and made sure you're in good enough shape you can actually move. But this is you've actually picked a tall mountain and you're climbing it. And you're working towards the top, and you're not a professional athlete that can do this every day, but you've started to actually dive in and make the process happen. That's what this is. This is the go now phase. And you're starting to figure out what do we really need to monitor, and part of that is having things actually run in production so that you can learn from it. Any more to say about that, Ivan, before I go on?
Oh, let's go to phase 3.
Okay, phase 3. Build confidence. This is one of my favorite phases, and I have things to say about this, but you should start since I keep stealing a lot of the thunder at the beginning. What happens in phase 3 here, Ivan?
There is so much thunder. No one can steal it all. So by this phase, this is also what I think of as, these next few phases we're going to talk about are, you're continuing to iterate. Things are continuing to be more and more tight in terms of efficiency. And so you've got more workloads in Kubernetes. Your CI/CD pipelines are certainly more established. Your confidence in shipping applications into Kubernetes, so that means you're deploying into Kubernetes more often, more successfully, is a thing. Also, what's starting to happen in this phase is you're continuing to gain a deeper understanding of Kubernetes. You're continuing to migrate more apps But on an organizational level, you're spreading Kubernetes across more of your organization. You might be spinning up more clusters. You're also experiencing more edge cases. So you might be realizing, oh, I have this application that whenever we update it, for a little while, my users, my customers receive 503 errors because they're accessing old previous containers that are in the process of being spun down. Why does that happen with this app? Is it part of my app code? Is it part of how I'm deploying things in Kubernetes? Do I need a pod disruption budget, which is a resource in Kubernetes that that relates to when I'm doing cluster upgrades? So that's separate from when you're deploying new versions of your app. All those factors, you might be starting to experience those kinds of learning opportunities. And you're feeling like you can still test things out, but you're a little more confident. If you fall, it's okay. You'll pick yourself back up. Your confidence is rising. You'll panic less as you're running into issues. And that competency includes things like selecting tools and so on. Go ahead.
Well, so back to my climbing a mountain analogy. Like the first time you climb a mountain, you had perfect weather, you made it to the top, you felt like $1 million and you came down, right? That was phase 2. Phase 3 is you get stuck on a mountain once in a windstorm and you find out you can get through it, or you have to hike down in the snow and you survive and you're like, hey, I'm not going to die every time I do this, right? It's part of this confidence building phase is you have to have production incidents at some point. Everybody does. And when you're in this phase, this is when you're having production incidents in Kubernetes and you're recovering from it. And you're realizing as a company, oh, we can recover from this. This isn't, we made a choice to do Kubernetes and Kubernetes is evil and now all of our downtime happened and we have to change our business to a blockchain something because all of our customers have fled. That's not what's happening. This is outages happen. We learn from it. We know how to recover. We know where to go look. We've learned the systems deeply enough that we have the confidence that we can build this and build more and more processes for scale. You're still learning. Even when you're all the way in production, you're still learning.
And as a partner, we're good at helping our customers not burn their error budget, but it's still super important to set that expectation, like you just described. The other thing and kind of the pain scale of this phase before we move on is that you might regret some decisions you've made during phase 1, the transform kind of POC type phase, right? That's okay. That's normal. That's growth. So again, I mentioned when we talked about that phase, don't try to do everything all at once. Don't try to make all the decisions for the future. That's not always an easy thing for us engineer-minded folks to try to foresee around all of the corners. But we want to call out here that regretting some of the decisions and revamping aspects of what you're doing, realizing that you need different tools and so on and so forth, that's normal. That's going to start happening in this phase.
Yeah, Hemant, I think it's Hemant, I'm not sure if I'm saying your name right here, but this is where you are at the moment in your organization, failed a couple of times already in the last 2 weeks and learning a lot from there. Yeah, I say this is my favorite phase because you're there, you've made it, you're in production and you're just figuring it out. And you have to keep figuring it out. And it is a little painful, but you do learn a lot. And you particularly learn a lot when something happens and you have to recover from it and it's your production environment. So you can't afford to, sit around doing things wrong. So I get that. And that's exciting. So there is a question that came through. I'm going to stop and answer real quick. There is a Q&A section in the tool here. So if you have questions, feel free to post them. We may save most of them for the end, but this one I think is relevant to stop for a second here. From Charles, it says, the maturity model or the phases on the journey to Kubernetes make sense, but any idea how long this should take? I'm not sure there's much of an answer or I'm sure much of the answer is, it depends. You must work in ops, Charles. It depends. But what is the median?
So you really are correct about that. And I also want to point out that we see people traversing this model multiple times because sometimes you might want to apply this journey to individual applications. And so that's one way to do it. We also see, folks, making other transformations and the aspects of their IT and going back over phases. It's not a rigid set of phases and things. This is the things that are in each of these phases. You might experience them at other phases, and that's totally fine. And what we're talking about here represents something that we see most commonly. And that's how we've decided where to bucket these things in phases. But per your question in terms of timing, yeah, it really depends on a ton of stuff. Sorry.
Well, so I'll give a couple of examples here. Small startup comes to us and they say, hey, we've been on Heroku for a while. We expect to scale 150 times, 150x over the next year. We have 2 services. We want to throw them in Kubernetes so they can scale like crazy, and we're prepped for the future. Great. We can probably have the environment stood up in a couple of days, couple of weeks max, tweaked to meet the customer's needs. They can have their services moved over pretty quickly because they only have a handful of customers, even though they expect to grow really significantly. Building CI/CD pipelines out for a couple of apps, pretty easy, right? And you could literally make this entire journey in a couple of weeks. On the other hand, we have customers who started working with us 4 years ago and have hundreds and hundreds of services, and significant percentage of what they have has been up and running in Kubernetes for a long time, and a significant percentage of it is going to take 10 more years before it's all there, right? Like there's some amount of that. There's also, to Ivan's point of traversing this multiple times, I can think of one very specific financial industry company that, they have a couple of different clusters that are very, very mature. And they've made a decision as an organization to allow everyone to spin up Kubernetes clusters. And they're putting policy in place so that, hey, you can spin up any cluster you want as long as it's following this policy. And so it's kind of like they're in different places at the same time. On the one hand, their main clusters are very mature. They've been through this process. The main application's deployed there. On the other hand, everyone in the organization now is spinning up their own stuff and deploying things into it. So it depends. You're right. That was the answer, and I'm really sorry that that's disappointing. A lot of it depends on how big your organization is, how fast you are to move, how much flexibility you have to kick the tires, and if DNS is working that day.
I've been talking a lot in these phases about leave time for your team as they adjust. There's paradigm shifts, allow them to grow. Yeah. That's a big factor, and that matters. You need your team to be able to make that shift, and so that's going to be a huge variable in this too. Should we move on to phase 4?
Phase 4, improve operational control. So this is the phase where you're starting to, you've been through enough, you've learned enough the hard way, that now you're getting to this level of maturity where you're stopping and saying, how do we make this really secure? How do we ensure that we have the right policy in place, that we can get to the compliance needs that we have? This is, you're continuing to climb. You maybe are running a marathon up a mountain now, right? And you're learning how to optimize. How much water do I take? Where do I stop and take breaks? How much ibuprofen do I need to survive? That's probably a bad example, but those kinds of things. Go for it, Ivan. What else is happening?
You're starting to develop better standards, your own defaults around containers and how you're running Kubernetes in your organization. You're probably, if you haven't already, you're starting to realize those business values that you talked about way back in what I call phase 0, the prep phase. You're able to ask informed questions sooner, more naturally as part of new projects that you're tackling in your org. And you're over that first set of speed bumps. To give some examples of the kind of things that you're probably tackling in this phase that Kendall alluded to, how do I get my app to be even more resilient running in Kubernetes? How do I improve role-based access control in Kubernetes so that not everybody is cluster admin in the cluster? What do I scale my application on? I don't want to just scale on CPU because that's kind of a subjective metric. Maybe there's a metric that's more meaningful to my app, like how many things need to be processed off a queue, or something that is more indicative of actual requests from customers, that kind of thing. So this is where we also start a bit of our policy part of our journey, right? So that thing I described earlier about you're starting to get your defaults set and your brand, if you will, of how you do Kubernetes in your org. That also comes with, it sure would be nice if we could have some guardrails that would help us enforce our standards as we're developing them in our clusters.
Yeah, and I think that it's important to say, we have this focus on security and policy enforcement in phase 4. And part of that is, I was listening to the news the other day about all the ransomware things that have been happening in the US recently, right? And part of that is the American startup view of, and I assume not everybody who's here attending this is even American, right? But there is a very specific view in American tech that is move fast, break things, and we'll get back and fix it later and make sure we're doing it right. So while this is the time where we're saying you're mature enough to really get security locked down and feel good about it, you don't want to wait until phase 4 before you're thinking about it, right? Same with policy. Like, you should have some amount of policy out the get-go. Like, not everybody should have root access to everything, right? Like, that seems obvious. Some organizations miss that. Don't wait till phase 4 to have some of those basic things. In phase 4, you can pause and really lock things down because you're at a place where it's not just putting out fires and keeping the lights on. But to be clear, we're not saying wait until you're here to do this, but this is where you're able to assign who's responsible for what. Where does the buck stop with security? Are we sure we're monitoring the right things, and are we sure we're getting alerts for the right things? Are we being efficient with our use of Kubernetes, right? And the policy and all of those pieces are there. Again, the software tool I'm going to show you in just a minute addresses a lot of these things. It's relevant even earlier in your journey because getting these things right early means fixing less later on. But we see folks in this phase of their maturity is really where they feel like they have the breadth and the area and the room to stop and really get this right.
Let's run through phase 5 sort of quickly, and we're almost going to be okay on our timing.
We're okay. We're okay.
So
optimize and automate.
Phase 5. We're starting to measure and control and improve operations through even more automation. So like we've both said different times throughout this presentation, this doesn't mean that this is where you start this particular work. It doesn't mean you have to delay it until phase 5. But like Kendall just said about the previous phase, with respect to policy stuff, you want to make sure that, especially by now, you are starting to address these things. So we're going to measure and collect data to start getting ahead of problems. And we want to understand through collecting data, what does it look like when things are functioning well? And what do we measure? What do we want to implement for monitoring, more sophisticated alerting, and identifying what behaviors do we want to control around our security configuration standards, and starting to finalize really how we want to run Kubernetes in our org in a very automated way. So we're going to basically be automating a lot of these good practices that you have created for yourself in these previous phases, so that humans can manage less of the complexity and get back to your core business problems. So
the bits I would add to this is the policy phase. And you have put in place the tools to enforce that policy so that you're enabling service ownership in this phase, right? That's where your developer wants to push something into Kubernetes, and you have the policy and the tooling to enforce that policy such that the developer's not pushing things into the cluster that are fundamentally broken. You have that automation set up. It's not all operations fault. It's not all operations responsibility. Even the developers have the tools, the policy, and everything in place to make that work. In my opinion, this is the phase where you've got that runner, right? You've got the hiker. You planned to climb hills. You climbed hills. You climbed a mountain. You climbed a bunch of mountains. Got stuck in storms. Now you're a pro athlete running up mountains. And really, actually, this phase is, hang on a second. I can get up there a lot more efficiently on a bike, right? And this is realizing there's better ways to do this and faster ways to do this. And that's really phase 5. And this is to Ivan's point, you're going to go back and forth through some of these phases. You're never going to get out of phase 5. There's always going to be better ways to optimize and automate. But this is really where a lot of that journey ends. So
and some specific technical examples that fit into that. I could run all these places, or I could get a bike. If I've got a cluster that severely breaks, or I've got a region that fails in cloud, I want to be able to, recreate clusters easily, and I've got the automation to do that. Reverting is easily when something breaks. We want to get boring. We want to automate the management of things like cluster upgrades, and reduce toil on employees, and have things be as repeatable as possible.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so now we're going to tell you a little bit about Fairwinds Insights, and I'm going to show this platform to you. Stick around. We do have some questions we'll get to and answer, and there is the drawing at the end for the gift card. I won't be long or overly long-winded about this, I don't believe. So Fairwinds Insights, this is a software tool from Fairwinds. This exists to help you get security and policy governance right. And it shifts left into the CI/CD pipeline. There's also an admission controller. I'm going to pull up the platform and show you in just a second, but where you can think of monitoring tools as a fire alarm that tells you, is my house on fire? Fairwinds Insights exists to be more like a home inspector that walks through it ahead of time and says, hey, your house isn't on fire yet, but there's gasoline everywhere. It turns out the walls are built of flammable material. Also, you put in 12 bedrooms and no bathrooms. You put locks on all the doors, but you forgot about the zip line into your neighbor's house. Those kinds of things. This is what Fairwinds Insights exists to solve. Get that configuration right on the front end, and you're going to have a lot less fires later on. So let's dive in, and I'll show that to you. This is a platform that's relevant at any phase in your journey. When you log into Fairwinds Insights, you get an overview of your clusters. So I'm in an organization called Centaurus here. There's only 2 clusters. I'll click into one. This is the Proxima pod. You can see we're not deploying a lot of things into the cluster all the time, but hey, this one day in May, we deployed a whole bunch of things and introduced 27 new action items, one of them being a dangerous action item. Oh, 28. One of them being dangerous, 27 being warning. So we're going to give your cluster an overall health score, let you know how you're doing, and then we're going to track that health score over time. This one's not changing much, 81, 82. And we also have some cost analysis on this. So I'm going to get into more depth on all of these different things. But that's at a high level, this big picture view into your specific cluster. Now, a lot of the bulk of the information is here in the action items, where we're going to be digging through your cluster and prioritizing things that need to change. And so, here we have warning items. Up here we have danger items. A lot of the danger items are security focused, but we're looking at things such as reliability and efficiency as well, as I mentioned. You can click into any of these items and it'll say, here's what's wrong, and importantly, here's how to go about fixing it. So you don't have to be a Kubernetes expert in order to go about fixing these things. You can delegate them to different people on your team. There's a button to press here and assign things. You can say it's working as intended, so it disappears off the list, or you're not going to fix it. You can also create a ticket, kick that out to Jira or something like that. Now, where are we getting all this information from? This is a whole bunch of open source that we're leveraging underneath. A lot of it is Fairwinds open source. Polaris checks for common misconfiguration issues that we saw. Nova is another one of our tools, checks for out-of-date Helm charts. Pluto checks for deprecated APIs. Goldilocks helps you get your resource requests just right. And there's a price component, cost component there that I'll show you in a second. But we're also leveraging Trivy, KubeBench, KubeSec, KubeHunter. These are best-in-class third-party tools. Focus on security in your Kubernetes cluster. And then we do have support for OPA. That's the Open Policy Agent for writing custom policy for your cluster. So if you have specific compliance needs, those kinds of things, OPA can help you get there, check for custom things. Now, I showed you that big long list of action items. If you wait until things are in your cluster, in production, and broken, you've waited too long. So we have this integration in the CI process, also as an admission controller, but the average engineer is going to interact with it this way. They're in GitHub or GitLab or whatever you're using for Git, and they issue a pull request. And here we've got an engineer trying to run a container as root and add in secure permissions to the container. And you can see Circle CI has passed this, Fairwinds Insights has failed it. So then the average developer doesn't know a ton about Kubernetes, it's okay, clicks this button, comes in and sees, hey, things should not be running as privileged. Here's the problem, it explains what's going on, and importantly, tells you how to go fix it. So this is where you go, this is what you toggle, and everything's gonna be fine. Now there's a lot more here. We have workloads telling you what's out of date in your, add-ons telling you what's out of date in your cluster, what's deprecated, what needs to be updated. We have some insight into role-based access controls, so you can take a look at what all is available in your cluster. But sticking at a high level, here's the last piece I'm going to show you, which is we do have some cost analysis where we look at your total cost, what workloads are using the largest percentage of your organization's spend inside of Kubernetes. It's very Kubernetes specific, but you can click on any of these and you see we have a Jenkins deployment here. There's only one pod running. It's costing you $3.66 per month. With our recommendations, it'll only be $1.16. So you'll save $2.50 a month. That's probably not worth stressing out over or changing, but if you have hundreds of pods or something that's wildly over provisioned, this can save you a lot of money over time. And what we're doing is leveraging the vertical pod autoscaler underneath, as well as some Prometheus metrics if you're using that, and gives you insights into how bins are packed, et cetera. There's a lot of complex logic happening on the back end, but that's Fairwinds Insights. If you're using Kubernetes and you want to get it right, this tool exists to help you do that. There's a lot more here that I didn't show you, including places to write that custom OPA policy, ways to integrate with your repositories and dig through that. So I'm going to stop here. If you want to know more, check us out at fairwinds.com. Happy to talk you through those things, but let's wrap up here with a polling question, and we'll dive into answering our questions that have come through. So what is the greatest opportunity to improve your Kubernetes environment? And let's go ahead and pull that poll up. So get help with the basics, general best practice assessment, implementing the right security configuration, saving money, or improving my service reliability. You may notice these questions are relevant to the software that I just talked about, but it's helpful for us to understand where folks are and where they can see the biggest improvement in their environment. So take a second and fill out that poll, and then we'll get to answering our questions. I guess one of the questions I remember that was in there is from James and said, what's the relationship between Kubernetes and Docker? And Ivan, you want to take that one at a high level before the poll wraps up?
Yeah, sure thing. So at a high level, Docker is a tool that streamlines the creation of containers. So you could use it to make container images. You can use it to work with containers on your laptop and so on and so forth. Kubernetes is a thing that's going to help you orchestrate or run and organize and scale and heal the containers on a series of servers or compute instances or virtual machines to actually run them in, non-production and production environments. So it's there is also a thing called Docker Swarm, which I don't think was part of the question, but so that's Docker as a tool versus Kubernetes.
Yeah, and let's wrap up this poll. And let me look at the answers here. Okay, let's see. Looks like 26% of you said to improve your Kubernetes environment, the biggest thing you need is just getting help with the basics. So I get that. We'll show you just a second here. Actually, I'll pull that up right now. We have a Kubernetes best practice white paper. And why is it? There we go. Not advancing on the screen. You can go to Fairwinds website and download this. It's going to give you a whole bunch of help with the basics. So if that's what a lot of you need, check that out. General best practice assessment, that is an offering that we do at Fairwinds. We are happy to dig through what you have and tell you what needs to be improved. The software will also audit that. And if you talk with some of our folks, you can get a free trial of that and get in and see all the things you're doing wrong. Implementing the right security config is 26% of you. I'm sorry, I didn't say all the numbers here. Getting help with the basics is 26%. General best practice assessment was 13%. 26% said implementing the right security configuration is what you need most. Only 13% said saving money, and 22% said improving my service reliability. So all the things, it looks like that's a pretty decent spread, but yeah. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen so you can see our beautiful faces. And then let's get to some of the Q&A here. So I did what's the relationship between Docker and Kubernetes? Should cost control be somewhat part of this phase 4? Because now you can visualize how much cost you can spend and on what kind of services. What value do they add? And accordingly set alerts and controls, etc. So yes, cost control is part of that optimization, and that's all part of that phase 4 and phase 5. I think that the two are going to bleed in together in some of that.
Definitely.
There's the interesting thing about cost control in Kubernetes is cost is a little hazy in Kubernetes, and that's why you need a specific Kubernetes tool for it, because it's easy to watch, how much is an EC2 instance costing you, but Kubernetes is going to be doing some logic if you're using auto-scaling where it's scaling things up, scaling things down, and you get affected by, the individual workloads being scaled by Kubernetes. And so, you need alerts in there. I have a good friend who's a director of engineering at a company where, one night he got his AWS bill and saw that a service cost them $50,000 more this month than it had the month before. And that was significant for them. And thankfully, it was like it had all scaled up the day before. And so they got their bill and noticed right away. But if you don't have tools that are exposing that and going to alert you when those things happen, it can get you in trouble, for sure.
Yeah, to the point of the question, I think that is sort of asking, why is cost mentioned, pretty late in the journey. I'll just remind that it is in the later phase, because it's like if you haven't addressed it yet, in the phase where you're continuing to improve measurement and control and operations stuff, definitely start looking at it now. So, but by no means do we mean you should wait. Per your point, absolutely. If you can do it in the prior phase or in all phases, a big part of cost when Kubernetes is going to relate to, Kendall mentioned earlier, packing bins. So bin packing, in terms of if you imagine a Kubernetes node or a compute instance being like a box that you're going to put a bunch of different size books inside of, Kubernetes will decide which boxes to put which books. Well, that's going to be impacted by the limits you impose on your containers for CPU and memory. And getting those just right was something you saw briefly in the Insights demo that he was walking through. But things like that, you're going to continue to tune resource requests and limits for CPU and memory as you work with your applications in Kubernetes all along the way. And that's also going to constantly change your cost variable.
Yeah. A real quick question, does this integrate with Azure Kubernetes? I'm assuming that is related to Fairwinds Insights. The short answer is yes. AKS, anywhere that you can run Kubernetes, you can install Fairwinds Insights. So it's just a Helm chart, and if you can run Kubernetes, you can use Fairwinds Insights on that. We have a production Kubernetes cluster running with a handful of applications for the entire organization. What guidelines do you have around the number of clusters to run? Do you see clusters organized around teams, groups, applications, systems? And that's a big, hairy question that I have a strong opinion about. But Ivan, you want to take first, since you actually know what you're talking about?
Yes to all of those things that you mentioned in the question as possibilities. We see all of them. This is a very another it depends and sort of hand wavy answer. You can organize by namespaces and use things like network policies to help control which workloads can talk to which workloads from a networking perspective. You can use role-based access control to also keep people from deploying in places of a cluster that they're not supposed to deploy to. But it depends on a lot of things. And Kendall, what were you going to say?
Well, there's to Ivan's it depends. We have seen organizations do it every which way. Now there's security implications. Do you have a multi-tenant environment? Do you want to have a single tenant environment? We have customers who, or I've talked to folks who stand up a Kubernetes cluster per client because their clients require that. I've seen organizations where every engineer can spin up a cluster and fiddle with it, but the only clusters running in production are the two that ops handles. Or, there's literally, it's just another logical way to split things up, in the same way that, like, how do you split up servers? Does every engineer get a server? Does every engineer get a piece of a server? Does every engineer get 20 servers? It depends. There is a lot of different ways to do it. And part of it is, how are the clusters networked? How are you scaling? How much fine-grained control do you have? What are your security implications? All of those things are questions that you have to ask to be able to address that.
Do remember that however many clusters you have, you need to upgrade them. And you also need to upgrade what we tend to call add-ons, which are the extra gravy that runs on your clusters that provide things like ingress, HTTP and gRPC ingress into your application, DNS management, certificate management, those kinds of things. So not that it should deter you necessarily from, I'm gonna have a cluster for every possible permutation of every possible thing, but what happens next is all of those need to be upgraded. And there are vulnerabilities and CVEs that happen in Kubernetes. And part of our managed services is we upgrade and deal with that pain for our customers. But depending on where you are in this maturity model, as you're getting started in all things Kubernetes, you still need to make sure that those clusters are kept up to date and secure, just like everything else.
Yep. And there's one more question here. It is a very specific to your specific use case, so I'm not going to address it in front of the crowd. However, if you do want to ask, it's probably the kind of thing we can help with. Reach out to someone at Fairwinds, and we can see if we can get you a quick answer on that. I want to be sensitive to folks' time and get you off here before the top of the hour. So, Charles, I'm going to turn back over to you. Thank you, everyone, for attending. We hope that you enjoy both the Agony and the Ecstasy. And I'm reading another question that just came in. And real quick, Thomas, yes, we have experience running those things on top of all those environments. The software can help, but reach out if you have questions. And Charles, I'm going to turn it back over to you. Thanks, folks.
All right, great, Kendall and Ivan. You'll have to unmute for just a minute, Kendall. What you mentioned for them to reach you for some of these questions, the in-depth, is it just fairwinds.com? And
yeah, go to fairwinds.com. There's a little chat bot. You can press a button and talk to somebody in sales. You can say contact us and get out. They can help connect you with an engineer who can help answer your question as well. But by all means, just reach out. Fairwinds.com.
All right, sounds great. And again, Kendall and Ivan, thank you very much. The juice was worth the squeeze. I'm telling you, I'm going to be using that one a lot. So this has been recorded and it is available on demand. You will be receiving an email, but you can also go to MediaOps.com. The 4 winners of our Amazon gift card are Mark M., Jack K., Timothy M., and James K. So you will receive an email from the or to the email address that you registered this webinar for. So if you check your spam folder if you don't receive it fairly shortly. With that, again, thank all of you for attending. Thanks Fairwinds for sponsoring, and thank you again, Kendall and Ivan, for a great presentation.
Great, thank you very much.
All right, bye.
Thanks.